All right, we're diving back into our journey through the book Capital Redefined, and today we're hitting a really critical part of Chapter 6. This is where the authors get into this huge debate within feminist theory about social reproduction. You know, all that work that happens behind the scenes, the cooking, the cleaning, the caregiving, all the stuff that underpins our entire economic system but doesn't get a paycheck. So here's our roadmap. First up, we're going to define what we even mean by this work behind the work. Then we'll unpack the big debate over how to value it. From there, we'll see how the authors of Capital Redefined find some serious limits on both sides of that argument. And that's going to lead us to their core idea of capital's hidden annexation. And finally, we'll wrap up by exploring what they propose as a different way forward, this idea of true value. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. We need to get a handle on this labor that happens in the shadows, the stuff that's truly holding our society together. This question right here, it gets to the absolute heart of something called social reproduction theory, or SRT. And what this theory does is it forces us to look past the usual stuff, you know, the factories, the offices. It makes us see all the other work that goes into creating and sustaining human life, day in and day out. It's the work that literally reproduces society itself. And when you think about it in practice, it's everything, right? It's caring for kids, making dinner, keeping a home from falling apart, giving a friend or a partner the emotional support they need to get through the week. None of this usually comes with a wage, but let's be real, without it, the paid workforce wouldn't even exist. They couldn't show up to their jobs. This is the invisible engine of the whole economy. Okay, so once we all agree that this work is absolutely essential, a really interesting debate pops up inside social reproduction theory. The big question is, how exactly do we understand the value of this labor in relation to capitalism? And this is where things split into two main camps. On one side, you have thinkers like Silvia Federici, and they argue that all this unwaged work directly creates capitalist value. So for them, the solution is to stretch our definition of value to make sure this work is included. But then on the other side, you've got theorists like Tithi Bhattacharya who say, not so fast. They argue this work is a precondition for value. It's something that happens outside of capital's logic, which actually gives it a special, powerful position to maybe change the system from the outside. Now, each of these views leads to a totally different strategy. If you're in that first camp and you think this work creates value, well, the logical next step is to demand payment. The famous wages for housework movement is the classic example of this idea in action. But if you see this work as happening outside of capital's direct reach, your goal isn't to get a paycheck from the system. Nope. The goal is to build brand new systems altogether. You know, autonomous economies that are centered on care, completely separate from the logic of profit. So you have these two powerful, competing ideas. And this is the moment where the authors of Capital Redefined jump in with their big critique. They take a step back and say, hold on a second. While this debate is incredibly important, both sides might be caught in the same trap without even realizing it. They pose this killer question. What if the very idea of value that both theories are fighting over is the one that was made up by capitalism in the first place? What if you're trying to win a game where the other side wrote all the rules? To get at this, the authors use a key concept from their own framework, which they call communist value theory, something we've talked about in our other explainers on this book. And that concept is fetish value. This isn't value in any real, meaningful sense. It's the warped, narrow version that capitalism cares about: wages, profit margins, GDP. It's how a rising stock market gets celebrated, even if our communities are falling apart. The whole point of fetish value is to hide what actually creates well-being. So the authors argue that because both sides of the debate are stuck playing the game of fetish value, their strategies end up getting co-opted. They call them civilizing mechanisms. So whether you demand wages or try to build alternatives, capital is pretty good at absorbing these things. It might create a new government program or a whole new market for something like childcare. And the outcome? Capitalism just gets a little nicer, a little more stable, more civilized, but it never actually gets transformed. And this all leads to the author's most powerful point, that capital's influence is way, way deeper and more sneaky than we think. It's not just that the home supports the factory. It's much more complicated than that. This right here is a huge shift in thinking. The authors say it's a two-way invasion. It's not just that family life supports the job. The logic of the job invades family life. The fact that a household completely depends on a wage totally reshapes how we live, twisting things like care and community into forms that are more useful for the system. I mean, think about how a 9 to 5 job controls when you sleep, when you eat, even how much energy you have left for your loved ones. The two are totally tangled up. Now, they're building on this idea from feminist scholar Nancy Fraser that capital basically eats its own foundations. It cannibalizes the very social and ecological worlds it needs to survive. But the authors of Capital Redefined say we need to take that idea one step further. They say capital doesn't just exploit these non-market zones like family and community. It actively invades them, it restructures them, it annexes them. It basically remakes them in its own image to make sure they'll keep pumping out what the system needs. This, they say, is the really hidden process, happening even behind the obvious exploitation of paid work. So if this narrow, distorted fetish value is the problem, what on earth is the solution? Well, this final section gets into the author's really powerful alternative, what they call true value. And the authors are quick to point out that this is not just some abstract academic game. They tie it directly to the politics we see every day. They argue that when progressive movements don't offer a strong, shared system of values that actually means something to people, alienated workers start looking for meaning elsewhere, and they often find it in the easy answers of nationalism and populism. So their solution is to flip the script entirely. Instead of letting capital tell us what's valuable, they say we should use the logic of life itself as our guide. True value, they argue, is what you get when the basic sources of life are able to flourish in a way that's good for everyone, harmonious, inclusive, and sustainable. Now, the authors identify 4 of these fundamental sources of true value. The book gets into the specifics of these later, but the core idea is that when these sources, things like our social bonds, our knowledge, our natural world, are treated like a shared commons, they generate real, life-affirming value. It's a logic of regeneration, which is the total opposite of capital's logic of extraction. And that's what this all boils down to. This is the powerful question the authors leave us with. If we could actually break free from capitalism's warped definition of value, what would we even start building? It's not just about thinking differently. It's about opening up the space to imagine, and more importantly, to start creating a fundamentally different world based on what actually matters.